Here we go. We are back. Everybody get a comfortable seat. Lumbar support. Lumbar support is the key to a good stream viewing experience. All right, guys. I got some stuff to show. Guys, look at this. Now look, you may notice some new visual stuff going on. This is a work in progress. I'm going to be, you see what's going on around me here? I've started thinking about this space in my life and trying to make it a little nicer. I don't know if nicer is the word. First of all, remember last week when I mentioned that this rack was going to be getting populated and moved into place? Well, it's been populated and it's been moved into place. And now I've got everything else I need to do, which is wiring, which if you can see this guy up here, my patch bay arrived yesterday, and that means I have the lonely task of soldering DB25 connectors and Neutrik XLR and TRS connectors and snake creation and all that stuff. So that's a little fun weekend project that lies ahead for me. But also, look at this. I pulled the doors off because I thought, you know what would be nice is like, look at this. Look, there's another room back there. Like a bike, and there's lights, and there's even more instruments back there and stuff. And so I thought, you know, it might look nice to kind of utilize the whole space and get the whole depth going on. I can move my keyboard over here. I've got some other stuff going on. We're going to get some proper lights in here. We're doing it up. Here's the good news. The good news is that all of this is happening because this has evolved from being a kind of, well, maybe not a throwaway, but a spontaneous, we'll do this for now kind of activity, to being a thing that we're going to be continuing to do. And so I'm sort of investing in terms of basically I've converted my living space into a YouTube studio. And so now I'm living in a YouTube studio for you guys. But I think it'll be a nice place for us as we kind of develop it more to kind of hang out and make our music together. So, Yellow Mug in the house. Now, listen, guys, how has your week been? How has your music been? I hope you've been making music. Don't be afraid to link us things in the chat and show us what you've been doing. Stefan is kind of always loving whenever he kind of sees that stuff. I love it too. He shares that with me. And so, yeah, as much as possible, we always love this being a bi-directional kind of conversation with the music that we make and hopefully the music we're helping you make. And then the music you guys make. So don't be shy about sending us that stuff. Either tweet it to us or on Instagram and tag us or whatever you want to do. We'd love hearing that stuff. So now, before I bring my guest on, I wanted to say something. I was even telling my guest before I got in here. I wanted to say something that's kind of on the heavier side, a little more serious side. I don't want to, I don't want to bum everyone out, and I don't want to kind of make it a big sad thing, but I did want to mention some news that happened over the weekend. We lost a member of the Reason community, Cookie Monster, who you may know from his music. He was a very popular DJ DJ and producer in the dubstep genre. He made some phenomenally dirty basses and some of that bass music. And we lost him this weekend, and it totally sucks. I was really sad when I saw it. I think everybody was. I was really surprised by the reaction online, the news that picked it up. It was a pretty widespread thing, and it was I don't know. I hadn't thought about Tony in a while. I met him in 2013, I think. I shot an artist feature with him, and I was in England, and I met up with him in Nottingham, where his studio was, and we shot an artist feature. And the thing that I remember about that, well, there's a couple things. One is he was like the nicest, sweetest guy. And I sort of at the time was fascinated with that genre because it was so built up around these artists who were kind of these rowdy, raucous party guys. Like that was a lot of the image of the DJ of that scene at the time. Maybe still to this day. But Tony was such a contrast to that. He was such this kind of relatively soft-spoken, sweet guy, and I just thought like, wow, like what a difference, you know. And what I saw over this weekend with people posting messages and stuff about him is that I wasn't alone in knowing that side of him. Everybody was just talking about what a sweetheart he was, and so anyway, he's gonna be really missed. And when I was talking to Stefan about the news and stuff, Stefan shared something with me that I thought I would share with you guys, because I thought it kind of spoke to kind of who he was when he wasn't being his public persona. He sent a message to Stefan via, I think it was a DM, might be Instagram. I don't know if it was Instagram or Twitter, but he sent a direct message to Stefan, and it was just a random thank you. It wasn't set up with any kind of like, hey, we need something from you, or would you mind promoting this for us? Or he wasn't asking us to promote his latest release. It was just a completely unsolicited, you know, shout out and thank you to Propellerhead at the time, Reason Studios, for making the tools that he used to make music. So I thought I'd bring it up on screen because I thought it does sort of speak to who he is. And yeah, so I seriously love you guys and preach about you to everyone. I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for Reason and the great work you guys have done. I can't thank you enough. And so, you know, nice to hear, but also just really speaks to who he was and the kind of appreciative and sweet guy that he was. So with that said, we're going to get to our stream today, but I did just want to give a shout out to Tony Cook, my condolences, all of our condolences to his friends and family. And I hope everyone else out there is doing okay. And if you're not, you know, there's resources to help. So let's not have too much more sadness. All right, now with that in mind, now we're gonna right this ship so that I don't just fall us into this eulogizing pit of despair. I want to bring our guest on. Our guest is a repeat guest. He actually holds the distinction of being our first repeat guest, if you don't count Matthias, and I don't fully count Matthias when he came on a second time because he's Matthias. He's like, that's like, I'm not a repeat guest. I'm just the guy at the company that comes on the stream a lot. So this is our first external repeat guest, if we can give him that badge of honor to wear. He was a really highly recommended repeat. You know, people would message us and comment, oh, you got to have Adam back. You got to have Adam back. And so I wanted to have Adam back anyway. And then the opportunity came up this week to have him back, and we were discussing what we could do. And Adam had this idea, and I just thought like, wow, that's a great idea. So we're going to talk about it. I'm going to bring him on, and we will discuss more what we have in mind today, and then we'll get down to it. So guys, welcome to the stream for the second time. That's the first time I get to say that. Adam Fielding. Adam, welcome.
Hello.
How are you?
Nice to be back. I'm very well, thank you. It's great to be back, and I feel honored to be the first repeat external guest. Right? I like that. Not
a bad title. Now, you know, this is like on SNL, on Saturday Night Live in the States, the show, there's this thing called the Five Timers Club, where when you have been on the show 5 times, they give you like this like fancy smoking jacket with a embroidered 5 on it and stuff. So you're
I need to step up my game if I'm going to reach those lofty five times goals.
I got to say, you're already 40% of the way there. So it's
I like it.
Not bad.
Statistics. Excellent.
Totally.
Also, I particularly like how you've put loads of effort into kind of making your surroundings look really excellent and wonderful and musical, and I seem to have just smeared Vaseline on the lens of my webcam, so just to hide the chaos that's around me. So
I applaud.
Unfortunately,
I applaud your efforts. Although, you know, I do wonder if like I've thought about using one of those kind of things on Skype calls and stuff. You can just sort of like, oh, I don't need to like pick up my clutter behind me. I'll just blur the background. But I always worry that like at some point that algorithm or the technology that does that's going to kind of like go away for a second, and it's gonna be like, oh no, my chaos
it does
is
make
in
me
full clear view.
Well, the problem is it tends to kind of blur me a bit as well, so it tends to sort of make me question my own existence from time to time. Am I just phasing into my background? It's
like your whole face gets blurred. Oh, really?
Yeah, it's weird. So if that happens, I can assure you I do exist.
That's good to know. Yeah,
I think. So yeah.
Well, welcome to the stream. How have you been in the weeks since we met? You, if people don't know, they should know, you run your own stream. You have your own weekly live stream.
That's correct, yeah. So in a similar sort of way to you, I guess, I kind of started doing live streams at the start of lockdown in sort of back in April. And I decided to start doing music making sessions. And I thought it'd be kind of a sort of 2 or 3 time deal. And I've just finished my 18th, I think. So so I've written quite a lot of music this year, sort of in front of an audience, which has actually been really exciting from a creative point of view. And it's just been wonderful to do that. And like I said, it's something I plan to dip into and then get out of pretty much when the world sorted itself out, but it hasn't, so I guess I'm stuck doing this.
The world has not sorted itself out, and we're the better for it because of your music. So thanks, COVID. But I was gonna say, I have to give you a lot of sort of kudos, because I have done not a ton on this stream. A lot of times I have guests, but I've done my fair share of making music live on a stream. And what I'm acutely aware of now, having done it as many times as I have, is that it doesn't go as easily as it does when you don't have, hundreds of people watching you, or potentially thousands watching you after the fact. Like, that is an omnipresent thing in your awareness, where you sort of put this pressure, at least I feel this pressure, to like create perfect music right away. And
well, one of the things I've really enjoyed kind of as it's gone on is sort of more and more regular faces have kind of been popping up during the streams. And I've had some really cool ideas while I've been working on tunes from the people who have just been watching, and it's just such a really nice sort of semi-collaborative way of working, and especially given the fact that I haven't really been working with a whole lot of people this year, for most of it at least. So it's just really nice to have that sort of collaborative spirit and just work on that. But even so, like, sometimes I tend to have like sort of strategies to get tunes going. But even so, sometimes I'll just hit a complete creative sort of creative brick wall. So that happened a couple of weeks ago, and I just had to say, look, I'm just gonna have to hold my hands up here. I'm not gonna be able to do a stream this week because everything I'm writing sounds pretty terrible.
Oh, interesting.
So it does still happen, but that's the only time that's happened so far this year. But it's just one of those things I tend to find, even when that happens, it's still best to take a step back and just kind of let yourself recharge your batteries, really. So
I had a moment happen on one of the stream. I can't remember which stream I was doing, but I was making some music, and then towards the end of the stream, I had to make a bass line. I was like, I'm gonna add a bass line, and I loaded a bass, and like all of a sudden it was like I couldn't make a bass line. And I've made how many hundreds or thousands of bass lines have I made in my life? And all of a sudden I was just like, I can't music. I don't understand how music works. And so I just was like, it just like wasn't happening. And so then I tried another, I was like, oh, let me try a different preset. And so I went to a different preset, and then I tried, and it was just like, nope, like just like trying to strike a wet match, just like not happening. And fortunately, it was at the end of the stream. So I was just like, all right, I'm done later. And I just signed off. But,
screw this.
Man, it was humbling. It's humbling sometimes to like, you suddenly go like, but there's a flip side to that. If I could be positive for a second, the flip side is that when you do have people watching and waiting, I imagine this is true for you too, you're forced to commit much faster than you normally would. And so you don't spend the whole evening working on that synth. You just run and go with it.
It's actually really interesting you bring that up, because that's something that came up during my stream last week as well. We're talking about someone asked how I was able to get ideas down so quickly, and someone else actually replied to that person saying, I imagine a lot of it has to do with the fact that, when I pick a sound, I tend to just commit to it straight away because I don't have the time to sort of go through 500 snares before I find the perfect one. I just have to pick one and go with it, and if it doesn't fit immediately, then that's too bad. You kind of just got to roll with it. And what generally happens is, after a couple of hours of using what you've been using, it tends to just sound right anyway. So it's a very interesting way of working, and it's nice to be able to kind of cut that element out entirely.
That's interesting. Yeah, just that alone, that idea, after a couple hours of working, it tends to sound right anyway. Like there's two sides to that. There's the psychology side where you sort of acclimate to things. Like to take a totally different example, I know when people are coming up with names for their brands or services, websites or whatever, like, you know, all names sound weird at first. Like you think the guy who said, I've got this new idea, it's called Twitter. I've got this new website, it's called Vimeo. Like they sound weird at first, but you sort of acclimate to them and then they become totally, oh, of course that's called TikTok, you know. But the same is true for music, that there are those things where you do acclimate to these ideas that might feel weird. And in some ways, some of the best sort of pop innovations have come from very weird sounding things that now feel very normal. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it's like it's two things I'm thinking of off the back of that, like technology that's used in pop music that's kind of become very standard. The obvious one would be autotune, and if memory serves, like that originally started out as a means. It was like something to find oil, or I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was meant. It was surveying oil fields to find.
I find that fascinating, the fact that was then sort of brought over to the world of music, and we've ended up with autotune, which is absolutely everywhere. Like everyone uses autotune. If you don't say you do, you're a liar.
And to that point, you know, the it's sort of the stuff of legend now. The fights that were had over putting that effect on that Cher and her producers were told, like, you got to pull that off, and they were like, if we pull that off, we're pulling the song. Like, we're not.
Yeah, that's the hook.
That's the hook. And actually, to take an older example, I just saw an interview recently with Keith Richards, and he was talking about the fuzz pedal that he put on Satisfaction. You know, that classic riff. It's widely credited as being maybe not the first use of fuzz and distortion, but the first use that really moved fuzz and fuzz pedals into the stratosphere. Like he didn't invent the pedal, but he used it on a way that suddenly everybody, like the week after that song came out, fuzz pedals were now a thing and people were all buying them and stuff. And he was talking about it in this interview, and he said it was a total temp. He wanted to have some kind of sound, but he didn't want. But he was actually going to make it a horn line, was the idea. So while he was in the studio, he plugged his guitar into this fuzz pedal so that he could sort of get a horn sound, and he played the line in. That's why it's just a single down. It's not like chords or anything. It's just down, 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 down. And he was marking its territory to be replaced by a horn section. And then that same thing you talk about, they sort of acclimated to it, and now it's an iconic.
And it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's I find that particularly fascinating. Firstly, because the idea of satisfaction with a horn is any kind of horn is just that doesn't seem right to me. And also the idea of using a fuzz pedal to somehow emulate the sound of brass is kind of, I'm not entirely sure I see the logic, but it sounds great. It sounds great.
On the flip side, though, there's a certain. Now, I'm always scared when I talk to someone British and I use the word irony, because Brits believe that Americans don't understand irony. But I want to use the word irony now, so I'm gonna try. I believe there's a certain irony in the fact that if anyone's been to American football games and high school American football games, Satisfaction, played by a marching band brass section, is like one of the classic songs that they play out in the field or in the stands when they're sort of rooting on the team. So it's sort of come full circle in that way. But anyway,
I guess that's kind of ironic. I'll let you have it.
Is it? Thank you.
The irony police. There we go.
Oh my God! I had a friend, one of my friends in the UK. I just remember him saying, like, "Ugh," he was disgusted with it. He was like, "Americans, they don't understand irony at all." And when he said it, I was like a 19-year-old kid, and I was like, "Oh shit, I don't think I do understand irony." And I can't ask him. I'll be confirming his bias. But he's right.
The secret is.
And so it's
secret is nobody really understands it. But we just pretend. We just pretend that everyone understands.
Maybe he didn't understand it. That's true. I should use that. I should be like, nobody. The problem with Brits is that none of them understand quantum particle theory. I don't know.
Oh dear. Well, I better start reading up.
It's just a defense. If I don't understand it, I'll just say that nobody understands it. Yeah, that's a good theory. I like that. But anyway, let's talk Reason. But before we jump over to Reason for a second, I did want to say you were saying you hadn't been collaborating with many people recently. But I wanted, are you able to kind of give a shout out as to the collaboration you were telling me about recently?
Yes. So I've
announce it in some ways.
Yeah, well, I've been kind of there is an announcement happening tomorrow, but I can't really sort of say a lot about it.
Okay.
I've been working with a couple of guys in the States for quite a while now. Otto Kate and Brian Skill, and they're both incredible musicians. I feel incredibly privileged to work with them, and we work kind of under the collective name Void Chapter. And it's really interesting because a lot of what we do is very, very kind of heavy, very intense, sort of cinematic stuff. And I have an absolute blast working with those guys on that because, like I said, they're hugely talented. And, you know, it's great to be a part of that. And we should be having some really cool news coming tomorrow. So watch the space. I wish I could say more, but I can't.
That's good to know. Okay, so I jumped the gun a little bit.
But it's awesome.
I gave you the
It's fine.
platform.
Yeah. I brought it up and I should have kept my mouth shut. So
Oh, I see.
I'm very much the one to blame here, but I'm just very excitable.
Well, okay. We'll consider this a tease. The tease is watch the space. Check Adam's. Check your socials tomorrow. Will it be mentioned out there on the socials?
Yeah.
What is your
absolutely?
It's Mr. Adam Fielding. Is that your Twitter?
My Twitter handle is Mr. Fielding because I wanted to use Ad Fielding or Adam Fielding, but by the time I joined Twitter, like the Twitter scrub I am, those names had already been taken, so I ended up going with Mr. Fielding. But I'm Ad Fielding or Adam Fielding pretty much everywhere else.
Gotcha.
So let this be a lesson to seize your desired handle on your social media platforms of choice.
Adam, can I commiserate for a second with you? I got it. Guys, people out there, this is an interactive thing. Talk about the lesson of grabbing your handles. There is another Ryan Harlan out there. He spells his name Harlin. He makes music, and he has SoundCloud.com/Ryan Harlan. And I don't want to say anything in terms of commentary about my opinion of his music, but I will say that I was saddened to see that I hadn't grabbed that URL, and it was like oh no, yeah.
Oh,
people, they can go out there and they can listen to some of that Ryan Harlan music that is not mine. So yeah,
it needs more banjo. That's what it needs.
Yes, exactly. There's zero banjo on other Ryan Harlan, doppelganger Ryan Harlan's music. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, let's talk about what we're really here to talk about, and sort of get into some music. So when you and I were discussing kind of what we could do on the stream, and you sort of floated the idea of this song that you had recently made. What you said was you made it using all stock devices, and that started out having advantages just in the practicality of we can share this file with people and everybody can open it and things like that. But beyond that, it did sort of instantly spark this rekindling of a love in my heart for Reason stock devices. And I imagine that's what happened when you made the song too.
Very much so. So it was quite an interesting one. So in some ways, I guess this could be kind of considered like a crossover episode, because this is the tune itself is actually a song that I wrote during a stream a couple of weeks ago. And it came out, well, I actually did that stream. It was the day after my good friend Tom Pritchard released all of his refills for free, which was an awesome move, because they're all fantastic and they just use stock devices in Reason. And it also meant that I could start using them in my streams, so I could share the project files and not be, stealing his patches essentially.
Right.
So I mentioned this to him, and he said, "Yeah, it's a great idea. Like I suggest the idea of writing a track using a lot of his patches, and for some reason, just kind of using lots of Thor and Maelstrom and all that kind of stuff. Like it just it put me in a very sort of Reason 4, Reason 5 frame of mind." Which I found oddly comforting when I was actually doing it. So I didn't actually end up using a lot of the newer devices. Like I didn't use Grain or Europa, like not taking anything away from those, because I use those on literally like everything I write, except for this one particular track. And I as I was working on the track, I decided not to bring in audio. I wanted to go very, very kind of into that sort of Reason 4, Reason 5 frame of mind. So which was, I'm not entirely sure how it came about, but it was sort of just this subconscious thing. I think the only thing I brought in that I would consider to be kind of new Reason was Beatmap, because I'm a slave to Beatmap.
We're going to take a look at that. But what I love about this, it's interesting for me to think about everybody out there that may be watching this now or after the fact. if you're a Reason user as long as you've been a Reason user, am I correct in saying that Reason 4 was kind of when you were kind of hitting your stride with Reason? You were not you had it earlier, but that's when you really were starting to like, oh, I'm starting to figure out this music thing and get my sound and all that.
I think that's a fair assessment. I started using Reason with Reason 1, but I very much agree that I think like I started writing some stuff that I was happy with Reason 3. Like I guess the best way I could describe it is I can listen to some stuff I wrote using Reason 3 and not be painfully embarrassed nowadays. And Reason 4 is kind of where I've really hit my stride, and that's what I used to write and record my first album. So that's very much like Reason 4 holds a very kind of special place in my heart for that reason alone, really.
What's interesting to me though is that Reason, if I'm coming into music making now and I get a copy of Reason, they're all new devices to me. So the way you sort of talked about it, where you were like, to take nothing away of Europa and Grain, and that's a Reason 1 user's mindset, that there's old devices and new devices, and you gravitate towards the new devices, and I don't know if you're tired of, but you just start to sort of think less of and use less of the older devices. But they're all new devices to the bulk of new users that are coming in,
Yeah, it's also in a weird sort of way. It's kind of like the burden of choice. You have all of these amazing devices that you can use ready out of the box, but where do you start? Which one are you going to sink your teeth into and really figure out how everything works? So on the one hand, like I do kind of envy anyone who's getting into Reason now, because wow, that is quite the powerhouse. But at the same time, that's going to be quite a learning curve. So
absolutely, yeah. I hadn't thought of that. I can't remember when I got into. I may have started with Reason 1. I knew those guys, so I probably started with it, Reason 1, just because they were friends of mine socially. But I think I didn't really get into it till Reason 2. My memories kind of, Subtractor and Maelstrom kind of were in my life at the same time. But that was kind of when you came in from the ground floor on a program like Reason, the devices as they get introduced, you do have that benefit of like, you learned Subtractor, and then you learned Maelstrom, and all you needed to learn about Maelstrom was the ways that it differed from Subtractor, and that sort of set your framework, right? Or the Nina 19 sampler, and then the NNXT came out, and it was like, oh, okay, how is this? What does this do that the one I know doesn't do? There's a natural learning curve, and there is a little bit. I would imagine if you're a new user, the shininess of Europa and Grain are enticing, but they're also really maybe deep if you're sticking your toe in the water. So sometimes these stock devices, or I mean those are stock too, but sometimes some of these devices that have been in the rack since day one have this enormous value in terms of learning as well, because they're a little more approachable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in many ways I was very lucky to get into Reason with Reason 1, because I learned how subtractive synths work through Subtractor. Like I had no idea how subtractive synthesis worked as a concept. I was purely a sample guy before that. So that was the perfect synth to learn about subtractive synthesis on, because it's so clearly laid out, and that was the only choice I had for synthesis at the time. And then Maelstrom came along, and I was like, what is this? What is this completely different thing? So it's always kind of humbling to go back and use Reason 1 and realize how few devices were actually available in the rack at the time. Lots of things that I take for granted now, like the NNXT and even sort of smaller devices. I can't think of anything obvious off the top of my head.
Sure, but all the half racks. I mean, we'll look into some of these in the song when we open it up. But did you find that learning subtractive synthesis from Subtractor, you must have had an experience then where you found yourself in front of perhaps a hardware subtractive synthesizer, and you were falling back on your Reason knowledge to actually understand?
Absolutely. That's one thing that I found really interesting about having used Reason since version 1, is that it took me a few years before I was actually sat down in front of actual proper hardware gear. And by the time I got to that point, I had a really good understanding of how it'll work, because a lot of what works in Reason translates pretty much perfectly into the real world. And the whole kind of cabling metaphor in the rack is just a perfect representation of that. It's everyone knows how cables work. You connect one thing to another thing, and they are connected. And obviously that translates really nicely into the real world as well. So yeah, it kind of provided me this really nice foundation. By the time I went to university, I had a really nice sort of foundation to work from. And even though I hadn't really hadn't had any formal music education at that point, it was just messing around with Reason basically formed the basis of my music tech education, which is actually kind of funny to think about in hindsight.
It's almost, I mean, when it was being created, it was almost the opposite. Some might say this is ironic. I actually don't know. I don't know if that's true. Don't quote me on that. But it was created with the opposite sort of intention. It was for people that had experience with these hardware racks and of gear and hardware synthesizers, and the metaphor was perfect as an entry point into computer music making. And now we've seen the world kind of flip on itself, where there's this trend towards hardware and Eurorack and these sort of resurgence in that. And Reason is the sort of the place where you can go that other direction now, where you can go, oh, okay, I understand Reason synths, and then you go to the real world and you go, oh, got it, CB cables, makes total sense, envelopes, all the stuff that goes into a synth. So
yeah, it's particularly interesting now because, I mean, if you wanted to get into any kind of modular setup, I'd say like a really good place to start would be to start messing around with Complex, because that is essentially a nice sort of, it's a sort of fixed semi-modular setup, but it's so much fun to play around with. And yeah, it's really, that is particularly interesting. So I do remember earlier versions of Reason being marketed as studio replacement, and like that was kind of its whole thing. And now we've entered this different territory where it's more about the hybrid setups and bringing stuff in. So I was very happy when things like external MIDI instrument, the EMI became a thing, and all that stuff, because that's when I started to get into sort of the hybrid myself. So I started bringing in sort of just little analog synths here and there. So it's one of those weird things. I always kind of felt like the development of Reason is always like the introduction of new features has kind of happened at a very similar pace to what I would like to see. So a good example of that would be the M-Class devices in Reason 3. When they came out, I was, begging for some, sort of more substantial effects and a limiter in the Reason rack. And then that came in Reason 3, and I was like, well, this is perfect timing. So that seems to have happened quite a lot.
We should probably let you know, Adam, we've actually set up a whole series of cookies on your machine. And so our R&D department, all they do, it's like the Truman Show. They just monitor your music making, and it guides every decision about what they do next.
That explains that voice I've been hearing.
Well, should we pop open this song? We're talking about a song that you made, and maybe it would be worth actually people hearing the song.
It's probably not a bad idea.
Not a bad idea.
Let's do that. So I'll just share my screen, and I hope this works. So you should be seeing the actual project now. So this is, like I said, this is a track that I wrote a few weeks ago during one of my streams. It took about 2 hours or so to write. And like I said, all of the devices here they're sort of older Reason devices, except for the beat map, because apparently I'm addicted to beat map. There's 2 devices in Reason now I would say that I'm getting sort of slightly worryingly addicted to. Beat map is absolutely one of them, even if I'm not using it for the entirety of my drum lines as something to trigger hats and extra percussion. It's marvelous for that, because you can essentially kind of sequence changes just by automating the density knobs, which is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I also realized that I have a hopeless addiction to the Synapse DR1 reverb, because I've used only RV7000 reverbs in this track, and I think I've used an instance of the old red RV7 somewhere. But I kept finding myself right-clicking and sort of instinctively heading towards the DR1 in my setup here. So I was kind of just going down here and just, oh no, it's grayed out. But so I kind of had to sort of wean myself off it a bit over the course of a couple of hours.
So
yes, let's
actually just take a step back. Let's actually just hear a bit of the song. Maybe we should start by just giving people a nice little. We have to play the whole thing, but maybe a good, I don't know, until I stop you. Let's take a listen.
I'll start just before block 1 and let it progress into block 3. That seems like a logical thing to do. So let's go ahead with that. I'll just play it, and yeah, here we go. feels like a nice natural place to stop things there.
I was just starting to kind of getting into the vibe and the groove of it. It was really nice. This is, I got to say, this is a classic. I may have used this term in the past. A Fieldian classic. You have such a sound. You really do have such a sound.
That's really funny. So I'd actually argue that the most recent music making stream I did last week, I'd say of all the tunes I've written most recently, that's possibly the most Fielding-y of them all.
The one you did last week?
I can't really explain why. So I feel like this may have been kind of a prelude to that, really. But it was just, I think it's a part of it is because I was using a lot of older devices and a lot of lots of sounds that I hadn't used in quite a while as well. So the vast
maybe
majority
that's sort of
of
what
the
I'm
synths
hearing.
in this.
It's like, I'm thinking about some of your early releases that you did.
Yeah.
When I call it Fieldian, it's sort of that, what was it called? Light Fields or?
That was like 2010, I think. So
yeah.
Oh man, I've never felt more old. I don't like time.
Oh, it could be Adam. My first band pressed cassettes. That doesn't make me feel good at all. So, yeah. But yeah. So let's take a look here now.
Cool.
I want to first off, like, there's so many places to get into and look at this song file, but one of the things I want to mention to people that you sort of brushed past when you were setting up this song is that you were using a lot of Tom Pritchard sounds.
That's correct. So yeah,
you're pretty much a friend of Tom. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Tom and his Tom. I mean, the genius that is Tom Pritchard.
I'll go a little. I guess I'll go a little into kind of how we met and stuff like that. So I originally came across Tom Pritchard on the old Propellerhead user forums. I noticed he was posting a lot of music when I was just getting into Reason, and I loved all of the stuff he was posting. And he started posting, we started sort of conversing on the forums, that kind of thing. And he ended up doing a bunch of refill releases as well, so he's designing patches and that kind of thing, and I absolutely love them. And years later, we actually met up in person, and we've been really good friends sort of since, really. And so he released a bunch of refills under the name Tom Pritchard Sound Design in sort of from about 2011 to 2013, 14 or so. And I used them as kind of the bulk of my palette of sounds for, I don't know, about 10 years. So yeah, that's probably why a lot of this kind of sounds like some of my earlier stuff, is because I use these, like a lot of these sounds a lot. And he recently released his refills. He's decided he's kind of getting out of doing sound design basically, and he decided to release all of his earlier products as freeware essentially. Yeah. So you can go and download those. If you go on Twitter and do a search for Patching Tom, you'll be able to find a link to all of this stuff. And it's
Tom, that's
absolutely fantastic.
That's his Twitter handle.
That's his Twitter handle. Yeah. Okay. So if you do a search for that, I think he's pinned the post possibly. There's a link to all of his refills there, and they are like, it's just staggering the amount of quality patches.
They are amazing. They really are amazing. And there was a period in time where that was no offense to everybody else that ever contributed a sound in the Reason Factory sound bank, but there was a period of time where I was so enamored with Tom Pritchard's sound design that it was like, oh, time to make music. Go to Tom's folder. Let's see what we got. Oh, wait, I need some drums. Go to Tom's folder. Let's see what we got. Like, that's just how I was doing it, Yeah,
I call that period of time like 2012 to 2018. So it was.
If I can give a modern shout out, Spio is a sound designer in the Reason Factory Sound Banks, the Reason Sounds folders. He's my new Tom Pritchard in that way. Where like when I'm looking for sound, I search for -SP, and I'm probably going to find the sound that I'm happy with his sounds. I love his stuff. But yeah, so yeah, for Tom, yeah, you used him for a long time and still do, obviously.
Yeah, I essentially had to kind of wean myself off his patches after a while, because I was like, I do a lot of patch design myself, and I was like, I've got all of these patches that I've made. Maybe I should start using some of those as well, as opposed to just all of Tom's stuff. So I actually put together my own custom patch library, which I've been using for a few years now, and it's just really nice to be able to dip into this folder and find sounds that I know are going to fit the style of music that I'm working on, because I made the patches.
Interesting.
If my patches don't fit the kind of music that I'm writing, then I'm clearly doing something wrong in my sound design.
Right.
So that's been quite interesting. But yeah, for the longest time I was using Tom's patches, and we still kind of work on music collaboratively now. We have a project called Neffel, which is like, it's more focused on using hardware instruments, and it's just it's an interesting kind of different way of working. It's also really interesting how we sort of both met each other through Reason, but we've kind of found these other musical avenues sort of on top of that, and it's great. So yeah.
So what we're seeing in your rack there, the things that say TPSD, that is Tom Pritchard Sound Design?
Yeah, these are all Tom Pritchard Sound Design things. So I might open up one of these devices now and just have a quick look at them. So I'll have a look at Dark Stab, actually, because this is a really interesting example of what I'm talking about. So I think the thing I like most about Tom's sounds is that they can be complex, but they tend not to be complex for the sake of being complex, if that makes any sense.
It does.
So yeah, so this is like, it is a pretty complex sound. Like if I just press a key, I think I've got a whole bunch of reverb and delay on that, so I might just bypass that for now. So this is just the patch kind of on its own. So that's just a single Thor patch. And one thing that's really interesting about this is, before this particular sound bank came out, I hadn't seen anyone using chord memory in Thor, essentially. So what Tom did was these are basically sequenced patches, and when you press a key, it runs through the sequence so quickly that it basically plays it as a chord.
No, really?
So yeah, that's... So if we disable if we just disable the step sequence altogether, it's a nice kind of clean sound. Then you sort of turn the sequencer on and you end up these kind of nice... I have a real soft spot for those kind of locked, almost kind of ravey chords.
Yeah, it's got that
it kind of reminds me of using... Yeah, it reminds me of using sampled chords when I was using trackers, sort of in the 90s and early noughties, and it's just I find it quite a liberating way of working, just knowing that you're locked to using the chords as they're presented to you.
Now this is a thing I feel like, just to give people a tip, if they want to get into this, if they've got a patch and they want to add this functionality to it, and maybe the patch wasn't made in Thor, this is a thing you can do with Note Echo as well, where you can...
Absolutely, yeah.
If you set your Note Echo... for people that might want to see this, I made a Note Echo tutorial, and I show this in the Note Echo tutorial on our channel. But basically, you set your time value to 0 so that when you play a note, the echoes happen simultaneously, and then you choose a chromatic interval, and then you dial up the number of repetitions, and then you can basically program in your chord. It's covered better in the tutorial. I'm not going to explain it easily enough here, but it does create that same sort of house and rave kind of parallel chords that they're locked, like you say. So
yeah,
that's cool. I didn't know
it's
you
really
could do
cool.
that with
Yeah,
Thor though.
Yeah, I had no idea at the time. I remember Tom was talking to me about it, and he said, I think I figured out a way to do sort of chord memory in Thor, and he sent me a couple of patches, and I was like, it's one of those things where I saw it and I thought, that's such an obvious idea. It's kind of amazing to me that nobody else had thought of it. It's kind of one of those obscure but obvious in hindsight kind of things.
Right.
So yeah, I just realized I could have just unclicked the chord button when I was showing it off earlier, but there we go. But yeah, I think Tom's patches are just, they're exceptionally good in that regard of kind of getting things out of the synth, playing to the strengths of the synth. And I think Thor itself is an incredibly versatile synth, and it just kind of requires some deeper programming when you're kind of putting patches together. So, like I said, this patch actually looks very complicated on the surface, but a lot of this is kind of related to the actual controls that are on the panel itself. So you could remove a lot of these controls and it wouldn't really make a lot of difference. But the way everything kind of comes together and forms this satisfying sound it's just really remarkable, and that kind of carries over to pretty much everything that he's done. He did a bunch of Complex 1 patches for the Soundbank with Complex, and they're sort of generative patches that play on their own, and they just sound mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So there's other tricks that he's used here. Like there's this trick of using the filter 3. So essentially, one thing I really like about Thor is the fact that you can just look at it and automatically kind of see where the signal was going. So looking at oscillator 1, that's going from here into filter 1, that's going into the mixer, that's going into filter 1, and then that's going down into the shaper, and then it's going on. Yeah, I say it's easy to follow, and then I'm finding it hard to follow myself. It's goes into the shaper, then goes into filter 2 through the amp into filter 3. So everything essentially goes through filter 3 that's kind of the final stage. And instead of using filter 3 as a filter in this patch, he's opened up the filter entirely and he's just dialed up the resonance a bit. And what that does is scoop the mid slightly. So he's essentially using the filter not as a filter, but as an EQ on sort of at the final stage. It's little tricks like that I just find absolutely fascinating.
I want to actually hang on. I want to dwell on that for a second. He's opened up. He's got a low pass filter. He has opened up the filter all the way. Effectively, that means the filter's. But until we get to the resonance knob, that filter's not doing anything.
It's completely transparent. If you turn the resonance down, it just sounds. I mean, I could just turn the resonance down now, and you might be able to hear the difference. So, if I just play a chord, and now if I just dial it up. That's perhaps not particularly noticeable via Zoom and YouTube compression, but there is a kind of a nice kind of mid scoop there. You'll just have to take my word for it.
I will. I mean, this is the thing. Filters, the resonance, the bubble of resonance that goes around. You know, when you this is the same thing is true on the mixer. In Reason standalone, you've got the mixer with the high pass and the low pass filters, and those have a little resonance bump at the point where you sweep the frequency. And this is a standard thing that happens on analog EQs in the hardware world, that you know, filters and EQs don't just drop off a cliff, they slope down, and as they don't just slope down, they actually kind of have that little lift. So if you can sort of hack that resonance to your advantage, then that can be kind of a neat thing. So that's a cool idea, to use the resonance without the filter frequency to actually create a little bit of a nudge there in the.
Yeah, so it's really cool. Like I've just looked at one particular Thor patch. Like this is just a single Thor patch, one of absolutely tons in those sound banks, and already I've showed off like a sort of a filter being used as an EQ, a sequencer being used not as a sequencer. It's just very, very interesting stuff, and there's a ton of stuff to learn there, and it kind of goes back to that mentality as well of having limited instruments to work with. So you find these little tricks and things that kind of work with them, and it's just really fun. I just find it very fun. So yes, that's one.
You took that sound though. Now you have added, that was just a Thor patch on its own. It wasn't a combinator, and you've added your own inserts to shape that quite a bit, actually.
That's correct. So if I just pop over to the sequencer and find a spot where it's playing, if I just solo a little section here. So the three main things I've got going on here are, there's a low pass filter, which is the little grey ECF42, which I still use loads, even though I have access to the SSL low pass filter. I still find myself turning toward the ECF42, and I can't really explain why. It's just one of those things. I think it kind of comes to that mentality of doing a lot of my mixing in the rack. I think I might have mentioned this before, where I try and get everything sounding roughly correct, but before it hits the mixer, and then I can, when I'm actually looking at the mixer, I can focus on mixing as opposed to worrying about whether everything sounds correct or not. But it's kind of a sort of top-down approach to mixing, I think. But I know a lot of people don't work like that, and I didn't always work like that. But so
those
yeah, I've just got a
half-rack
simple
devices, you know, those are I have to say those are some of the most overlooked devices in the rack, because it's like, I don't know, size bias or whatever the reason is, like they're just half a rack.
Yeah, it's,
you know, I don't know.
I always find it kind of fascinating that I use saturation knob quite a lot as well, but I find the form factor of the ECF42 much more satisfying than the saturation knob, which I love to bits, but it does not need to be that big. but that's a whole other thing. So I'm just using this kind of simple ECF42 just to kind of roll off the highs at certain points in the track, essentially using it to kind of as kind of a volume control. That's something I tend to do in a lot of my music, is use filters as opposed to volume automation if I'm fading elements in and out. I'm not entirely sure when that habit started, but it's something I've been doing for quite a while, and I think it's just a part of my sound at this point. But that's going through an RV7000, which is I've set the dry wet knob to 77. So because that's over 64, that means that some of the dry signal is actually being lost as it's going through the RV7000. So there's more of the wet signal than the dry signal at that point. So at 64,
you've crossed over the 50% threshold.
Yeah.
You're saying?
Yes,
right,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're getting more of the reverb than the dry sound. So it's essentially kind of washing out the sound more. So we end up with this kind of more sort of ethereal, spacey sound. and that's going through the Echo, which I'd say the Echo is kind of an underrated device. It's so good, and in terms of sort of big feedback washes, I just absolutely love what it does to individual sounds. And I've used quite a few of those in this track. So if I just play this particular section here, this is actually an example of one of those feedback washes. So this is just that same Dark Stab Thor patch going through the filter, the RV7000, and the Echo with some additional automation. So I'm just going to play that for you. So it's this kind of nice sort of dubby kind of feedback effect, and that's something
wild too.
Yeah, that's one of those things I've really wanted to see in Reason before it was introduced, was kind of really nice dubby delays, to the point where I was creating weird chains of RV7000s and DDL devices feeding into Scream 4 devices and then feeding back to add saturation. Wildly unpredictable and not particularly musically useful, but I use those an awful lot.
But so now the Echo is one-stop shopping for you in that regard.
The Echo is essentially the one-stop shop for me. I do also use Valhalla delay quite a bit as well, but I do tend to find myself turning towards the Echo a lot even now. It's a seriously powerful device, and even in terms of sort of the creative possibilities when you're using the various modes and stuff as well, and you start automating the delay time, you can end up with some really interesting stuttering kind of effects.
Right. Well, you know what's funny in the comment section? So you said, the Echo you said something like, it tends to get overlooked, and I said, people overlook the half rack devices. Every time we're saying that, the comment section is lighting up with people going, I use the half rack devices all the time. And, so.
Yeah, love for the half rack devices.
I know, right? But I think that the interesting thing is, when you said, the Echo gets overlooked, I was like, what are you talking? I use it all the time. So I think,
it's just my own personal impression.
I know. I think we all have there's a certain hunches that we have where it's like, oh, nobody uses the channel dynamics. It's like, wait, no, I use the channel dynamics all the time. I think we all use all the stuff all the time in all our ways, but it's like, there's so much stuff that you may feel like, sometimes you feel like you're the only one that has realized this amazing gem that is this, tool. But the comment section is just, they're giving their love for half racks and Echo and blocks, all these things we're talking about. So.
Excellent. And that's actually something I wanted to sort of drift towards. I might go to that in a second, how I actually sort of started writing the track, essentially, because that's quite interesting. But something else, there's a couple of things I really wanted to dip into, which was there's this whole array here of Thor devices which I'm using as percussion. So one of the sort of included categories in Tom Pritchard's, I think it's in Thor Kit 1, which is a sound bank exclusively of Thor patches, is there's a percussion section, which I used a lot when it first came out, and I still use it now, except in this instance I've actually layered it up with some samples in this redrum here. So if I flip the rack around, you'll see that there's some CV outs going from various channels in the redrum to the inputs on these Thor devices. So essentially what that means is, if I press play on channel 1, it will play the Thor and channel 1 on the redrum, except I can't really hear it. So I'll use a more obvious example, which is channel 2. So that's the sound of a Thor snare and layered with a 909 sample from the factory sound bank. So if I just turn the volume down on the 909 snare and press play, so that's the Thor snare on its own, which is It's kind of nice. It's kind of got a nice bit of snap to it.
Yeah.
But I kind of thought it'd be nice to add a bit of body to it without having to sort of go nuts with EQ. And basically, I didn't want to descend into the snare rabbit hole. So I was like, what would work nicely to kind of give an extra bit of body to this snare? A 909 snare. You can't go wrong with a 909.
You can't go wrong for 909. That's right.
Yeah. So I decided to layer that up with the snare, and together I think they work quite nicely. So if I just turn that up, you'll be able to hear. So it's more obvious.
Yeah, so it does. It just gives it a little extra body. That snap crack of the Thor snare is still there.
Yeah, so it's interesting kind of.
Some people might be surprised to hear drum sounds coming out of Thor in that way if they don't think of synthesizers as drum tone generators.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's quite a lot of options for that now in Reason. You've got the drum synths in Kong, which I must admit I don't use as often as I should really, because you can get some really interesting tones out of that. And Thor is actually surprisingly good for percussion. So there's that's a sort of little clap kind of sound, and got some extra percussion. So that's just that's a Thor patch there, nothing else layered on top of that. And that's a Thor cymbal. So one nice thing about using synths for drums is it means you get that kind of extra flavor of every single hit having a slightly different sound to it. And that's quite obvious with this particular cymbal sound. Like every time you press play, it's just a slightly different sound. And you don't get that when you're using samples, unless you have loads of kind of round robin samples lined up.
Adam, you kind of blew my mind with that one. I never considered that as a totally key advantage to using synth percussion, but that is that's what I mean. Natural. If you hit a cymbal, a real world cymbal, you're going to get a little bit different sound every time. So it's a more natural, weird, ironic, one might say, that a synth would actually provide a more realistic result than a sample would in that regard.
That's actually a really interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I've used other tricks before, like I'll have a CV input on the back, or I'll use so on the back of the redrum you have the pitch CV in. You can hook that up to something like an instance of Pulsar. You could just have the pitch vary very, very slightly as the track goes on. You end up with kind of slight variance that way. So I might actually do that on one of these here, just dial that in a bit. So now you're getting kind of more obvious pitch variance on the sample. So that's kind of another way of adding a bit of variation to drum samples, is to just modulate the pitch slightly. Here I've gone quite overboard because I'm trying to show it off. But so it sounds, it's every single hit sounds slightly different, and if you kind of dial back the level here and turn the rate down, you could end up with a much more kind of gentle drifting sound. Or you could even use a sample and hold, sort of random LFO there. That would probably provide a better result actually. So yeah, that's a really interesting way of kind of humanizing samples. But yeah, I really like using drum synths just because it allows you to make changes to the actual sound as the track's progressing beyond the obvious automating decay. Except in this particular track, that's literally all I've done is automate the decay on this synth drum. So yeah, perhaps not a great example in that regard, but yeah, it's a very interesting way of working, kind of using synths for percussive hits.
That is really cool.
So,
I often, in these streams, I often think of I kind of assign myself some music making homework, and I sort of hope that people out there do it to themselves. You know, I mean, I far be it for me to assign them homework, but when I see things like, okay, using synths as drums, and then that thing you did with Pulsar where you're actually hooking up a Pulsar to vary the pitch just ever so slightly is such a neat concept that I just go, where will that take? If I just take that idea, where can I go with that? What music will happen if I just set out with that as my goal? So that'll be a part of what I do this week. Thank you, Adam.
Oh, fantastic. But yeah, it's really interesting because one of the things I really like about music in general is kind of, I like the little touches that you find here and there. And I think kind of, I'd never say that a track, like the time you spend working on a track and the attention to detail should ever be representative of the quality of a final track. But it's nice to include those little details. It's something you might not notice consciously when you listen to something, but on a subconscious level, I think it does kind of filter in. And it's just nice to include those things. So yeah, it's a really neat way of working. It does kind of give it more of a, especially being as I'm using Beatmap to introduce further percussive variation, it kind of means that I'm not having to spend ages and ages writing a complicated drum pattern, but with the kind of variance provided by the sounds and the actual sequence itself, I'm getting kind of some quite interesting drum sounds.
So should we talk a little bit about Beatmap? Because that is talk about New World meets Old World. That's Red Drum, Reason 1.0, and Reason 11 stacked on top of each other.
Yeah, we've got Reason 11, Reason 1, and Reason 4. So I feel like at some point I need to make an interesting combination of all of these. But yeah, I'm trying to think of how.
Which the beauty of that is that's what you call Reason. It's like Reason 1, Reason 4, Reason 11.
Exactly.
It's that's just Reason. It's like this, the same stuff. You can open a Reason 1 song in Reason 11 because it is just Reason.
Yeah. And it's amazing how Beatmap just works out of the box. You stick it on a redrum and it just works. So what I did here is, I'm pretty sure during the stream I literally just fired up Beatmap, clicked on the spawn XY button and was just like, yep, that sounds fine, I'll leave it. So if I go to the sequencer now, there's this gigantic muted channel here, which was the beat map bounced, which is in the final project, but I've muted it here because I wanted to play around with beat map a little bit. So where is the beat map channel? So unfortunately, this project is also a bit of a mess. So I'm going to put
this is the nature of creating on the fly.
Yeah, I'm going to put the beat map with the redrum. So if you look at the beat map lane, you can see there's lots of kind of density automation going on throughout the track. So at the start of the track, if I just play that here, so it's not really playing that many kicks.
I see it now. It's coming up in density.
So the wonderful thing about that is I actually wrote a track right at the start of lockdown with the incredibly imaginative title of Quarantine, which I slightly regret going with that very, very cliched, obvious title.
Oh, we're in for it. In about 6 months, every artist can have their Quarantine album. EP. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I really want to avoid that, but unfortunately I fell straight into that hole and just head first with aplomb. So so it's the really interesting thing about this is it going back to that example. Like the first track I wrote was a track called Quarantine, and everything in that track, there wasn't a single note in the sequencer lane. It was all built using automation. So I was using lots of players. I think I used a matrix device to trigger some simple bass lines and stuff like that. But there wasn't a single note in the sequencer, and I found that as I was sequencing, I was kind of using automation curves as a way to control the intensity and flow of the track, rather than getting bogged down in kind of sequencing individual kind of flourishes and variations. And it was a really interesting way of working, and I don't really tend to do that whole lot now. And Beatmap is kind of perfect for that, because I think you can focus on kind of giving your drums a bit more extra intensity without worrying about how it's going to impact the overall feel of the track. If you just kind of adjust the density, it's not going to change the feel too much. It's just going to make things a bit more lively. And another thing I've done here as well is I've automated the XY position on Beatmap itself. So for some sort of variations in terms of fills, if I just solo the redrum and the Beatmap, in this section, there's a little fill at the end where I've just automated the XY position, and we end up with just this little variation,
like a turnaround.
there.
Could we actually? Is it since that's the XY? Could we actually watch it on Beatmap, because we'll see the map
absolutely.
shift, right?
I don't think the map. Oh, it might do actually. Oh yeah, it does. Oh, I'm thinking of So interestingly, if you hook up a CV input to the back of Beatmap to control the XY position, it doesn't display that on the display.
But it does for automation.
You can get around. You can get around that by putting it in a combinator if you really want to do that, which I have done before because I really wanted to do that.
I see. No, I find I do tend to enjoy watching that little map shift around. I've done that when I was making the original Beatmap video. Just watching it move around is like, I don't know, it's fun.
It's great. It's such a great little device, and I use it so much. Even if I'm not, what I tend to do nowadays, if I'm working on a track outside of live streams or even during live streams, is I'll program the kick and snare and kind of percussion patterns myself, and then use Beatmap to add hats and additional percussion over the top, because that's kind of, it's less essential to the feel of a track, but then you have the extra control over bringing in like very easy instant variations. Or if I am using Beatmap to control the entirety of the drums in a track like I am here, I will use those extra XY sort of automation just to bring in some fills, which I might, even if I'm not doing that, I might just bounce those to a note track and bring them in later. I do tend to have like a sort of temporary section at the end of a track where I have like a load of Beatmap note bounces they'll kind of bring in for extra fills, which is incredibly useful. So yeah, that's kind of I think that's one reason why I've been able to do so many streams this year, is because the drums are kind of taken care of. Like Beatmap has essentially become my drummer, which is really quite wonderful, really.
Well, that is great though. That thing you're talking about of the top parts can be handled by Beatmap. That's like a classic. Sometimes that stuff is kind of tedious to make, if I can use an unflattering word about the music making process. But when you want to get into like infinite hi-hat variations, that can start to feel kind of tedious to do. And this is a way where you can you can sort of ride the density knob. You're still in creative control of it, but you're not beholden to literally just like spending your evening clicking in, sequencer dots, in the piano roll. So it's great.
It's kind of one of those things where I feel like it's not going to affect the overall groove of the track too much, but it's going to add that kind of extra bit of flavor and variation if you do decide to use it like that. Whereas you can focus on the actual groove and kind of the overall feel of it. So I'm a big fan of things like that. And yeah, I can't remember the last track I wrote where I didn't use Beatmap, which is slightly concerning. But yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful device. And just going back to the idea of having all these different different versions of Reason clashing together in one project, there was actually one particular ARP that I'm using over, I think it was the Solaris ARP. So if I just solo that channel and play a bit of it over here, I think it's here. Nope. Where is it playing? That's a very good question. This is why you should organize all of your tracks. Here we go. So it's
nobody,
just this.
The fact that you do this live on air is amazing. No one will fault you for not naming your tracks and organizing them.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because over the past couple of years, I have actually become really good at organizing my tracks so I can bounce them as stems and send them to people. But in my streams, that kind of goes out the window.
No, it has to. Something has to go out the window, so that will be it.
Yeah. So this is just a really nice kind of ARP sound that's, again, it's one of Tom Pritchard's sounds, and it's from the Synthesis collection, which includes a nice ARPs section. And just opening it up, it's the first thing that kind of struck me was, there's a Maelstrom in there that's kind of generating some of the sound. But I noticed there's only one input on the mixer, so I was like, well, what's it doing? So there's a Thor there that's generating the sound. What's that doing? So I flipped it around and had a look because I was curious as you would be, and I noticed that Tom's actually using it as an effect. So he's using it as an aux send on the mixer here. So essentially, the main sound is being created by this individual Thor. So if I turn down all of the returns on the mixer, this is kind of the sound of just the dry Thor. So it's kind of a nice sort of percussive sound. It's kind of got a nice feel to it. And again, this is another good example of it's not a particularly complicated patch. It just has a nice sound to it. And once you start adding all the extra elements, then it just lets it shine. So turning all those up, what he's actually done here is he's using the gamelan as a filter. It's going through the filter section here, and it's going through a pair of AM filters with the resonance completely cranked up. So you end up with this really kind of interesting resonant quality. So if I just play it again,
whoa,
and if I turn the reverb and the delay off, so it's just kind of adding this really interesting,
it's like
slightly
a real
resonant
kind
flavor
of granular, quality to it.
And again, that's one thing I really like about Reason is the fact that you can just, if you want to use a particular filter on a synth, you can just say, oh, hey, I'll just bring out that synth and just route the audio through it and see what it does.
This is the thing. So the hidden effects, we talk about the half-rack devices and the echo and things like that, but the hidden effects that are inside these synths, the filters that are in Maelstrom, there's filters and effects in the chorus that's in Thor. And actually, I saw in the comment section that Stefan commented that his favorite reverb right now is the reverb in Complex One, and he
it's
taps
a really
into
nice
that.
Reverb. Yeah, that is a really nice reverb. And I think someone asked about that a while ago on Reason Talk, and I was like, yeah, that is a nice reverb, isn't it? So it's particularly fascinating, like the idea of just using various bits of synths kind of as effects. And I thought this was a particularly nice example because it's a synth from Reason 4 going into a mixer being processed using a synth from Reason 2. So it's like the meeting of the synths, but using them in weird and wonderful ways. And one thing that was...
There's a comment from, I'm going to call him Ty Blue Bear Boy?
Ty Blue, he's a streaming regular from my stream.
Oh,
so,
cool.
Hello, Ty Blue.
He says, he's got a question. He says, why would Tom even think of that? Like, I mean, what is the mindset of this guy that he would think of doing something like that? And yet it's so cool, and so cool that he did it,
Yeah, it's a very kind of it's some really, really interesting kind of lateral synthetic thinking. That makes it sound more like I'm implying Tom as an android or something. But what I mean is the world of musical synthesis. It's a really, like, I've learned so much from just even when I started using Reason, I learned so much by looking at other people's projects and kind of seeing how they were put together. And I feel like all of Tom's patches are basically that, but in patch form, and they produce good sounds that you can use. So even from like a purely educational perspective, I think it's worth checking this stuff out, just so you can kind of dip into it and be like, oh, that's a really interesting way of doing that. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Right.
And another really good example of that actually is one I've just remembered is so he's using the RPG-8 as an arpeggiator in all of these combinators, because when he made them, the dual arpeggiator didn't exist. That was the only choice he had to use. So I'm just going to bring this to the top of the combinator so I can show this off. One thing that I didn't realize you could do is on the combinator itself, you can assign a particular encoder to the pattern on the ARP. So there's this weird, it just says pattern, and it starts at 32,767 and goes down to minus 32,767.
Totally natural, obvious numbers, of course.
Yeah. Like I was like, what does this do? How does this do? So what it does is it basically just cycles through every single possible pattern variation on the RPG-8 itself.
Oh wow!
Using this one encoder. So you can drastically modify the pattern itself just by using an encoder. There's no control for this on the actual RPG-8 itself.
Is this part of Tom's patch, or is this something you discovered?
Yeah, this is part of Tom's patch. This is something I discovered by looking at Tom's patch.
Yeah. And just to clarify, when you said it's assigned to an encoder, I want to translate that. We're talking about a knob, right?
It's a knob. It's a knob. I don't know why I said encoder. That's a very fancy pants way of saying it's a knob.
Digital mixer with those encoders. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just So I thought that was fascinating, and again, that's not something I would have thought of. Just cycling through every single possible permutation of the patterns on the RPG-8. I mean, I think it only allows you 128 different possibilities because that's kind of the range of the combinator's knobs, but yeah, I just found that fascinating. It becomes more sparse as you turn the pattern knob up, and yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating. It's just something that I wouldn't have considered myself.
And what is it? Can we hear the sonic result of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it easy enough?
I'll just play that now. Yeah. So if you have it set to 0, it's incredibly busy, and there's a single note on every single step. You just turn it up, and it just.
Wow.
So I guess what you could do is you could just flip the values round and then call it a density knob, and then. There we go. I'm butchering Tom's patches. Excellent.
Blasphemy.
So that's probably a better way to sort of think about it. Is that it just reduces the note density as you turn it down. But yeah, it's really, really interesting, and I wouldn't have come across that. It's probably in the manual somewhere, and me being the manual ignorer that I am, probably just glossed over it. But yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm going to see if I can reset all this stuff back to how it was.
So I think people watching now that maybe didn't catch this at the beginning of when we started talking about Tom's presets here. Tom has given these away. If people are getting excited by seeing these presets and things that you can learn from them and music you can make with them, these are available. Tom is just...
They're free.
Yeah, these used to be things you bought from Tom, and then Tom had some sort of... I don't know. He was visited by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve. He woke up one day and he decided, I'm going to give this all away. And so he now does that. And so he's got a pinned tweet on his Twitter handle, which is, what was it called?
It's Patching Tom.
Patching Tom.
Patching, yeah.
And you can go there and you guys can all get this stuff and load it in and be happy for the next... Oh my God! Well, what do you say? 2013 to 2018, you'll be set for the next 5 years with patches.
Yeah. Well, it's just There's so much good stuff. Like one of my favorite bass patches is this particular bass from a reefer called Vast, which is just a huge library of sounds, and I just really like it. I mean, any Boards of Canada fans will recognize the name and probably the sound of the patch, but it's just such a nice enveloping sound. It's two instances of Thor, but even here, like those, they are not complicated patches on their own. If you look at them, they're quite straightforward, but it's the way they come together. It's like they're sort of put together with purpose, and I think that's kind of what separates these patches, is the fact that there's kind of a
because they were just they're single oscillator sounds. It looked like both just single. Oh no, there's two oscillators there.
Yes, this one has two oscillators. So there's the sawtooth oscillator and a pulse wave oscillator, both going through a single filter, and that's pretty much it.
Wow.
And that goes into the mixer, and yeah, it's very similar thing with this one, which is
a
also
really
using
nice
a
sound,
high-pass
really
filter.
tasteful, really tastefully put together. You know,
I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
I should mention, by the way, that Stefan has posted, for people watching this live in the chat or watching the chat replay, Stefan has posted the link to Tom's sounds in the chat. So
Excellent.
we can save you a trip over to Twitter.
Fantastic. It's all good stuff. And so what actually kind of started this track in the first place? Well, it's two things really. So I've been doing these streams for a little while, and obviously talking to Tom about it. And he said, "Oh, hey, would you be interested in me kind of supplying you with a couple of patches to maybe as track starters for your streams?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course I'd be interested. I'm not an idiot." So he actually made a few patches. So the second stream I actually did this year started with one of his patches, and this particular stream as well started with this track here, this instance here called Liminal Sequence, which is actually where the name of the track comes from, because it's kind of the backbone of the track. So if I just find that particular channel and solo it, so it's just on the left here. So this is just an instance of Thor going through a bit of RV7000, and the filter's completely open. So I'm just going to play this. And so this is without the reverb.
There's a very microtonal quality to it.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. There is actually a way to control sort of the pitch variance and kind of microtonal feel, but I kind of liked how it was originally, so I just left it. And the really interesting thing about that is if I dip into one of these blocks and have a look at the sequencer lane for Liminal, it's literally just a single note playing. So I'm not doing anything. It's just a single note. It's just playing the sequencer on the Thor. So
those intervals were baked into the patch by Tom.
Yeah. So everything is kind of controlled using the sequencer at the bottom here. And one thing that I was planning on doing originally was setting the direction of the sequencer to random. So as the track goes on, it could become a bit more unpredictable, and we ended up with some kind of wacky changes. Unfortunately, I didn't really like how that turned out, and I kind of like the sort of more hypnotic feel that leaving it static kind of lent to the track, so I just left it like that. But again, this is a really good example of it's a single wavetable oscillator going through the shaper, then going into low pass filter, and then through another filter, and that's pretty much it. And it's kind of the actual movement of the sound itself comes from sort of more subtle modulation. And another neat little trick here is the fact he's using LFO1 as kind of a random source. So he's using a sort of sample and hold type LFO here, and he set it to keysig, turn the rate right down. So what that means is every time you press a key, it will generate essentially a random value, and he's using that to control the panning. So if I turn the panning knob right up, you'll be able to hear it kind of panning all over the place. And if I turn that down, it's pretty much dead center now.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's just kind of nice little things like that. And because Thor doesn't have a means of selecting a random source, that's kind of a neat way of accomplishing that. It's just by using an LFO.
I was going to mention for people that, I'm thinking of people that might download these patches and use them as a kind of way to kind of dip into the experimentation realm. And it's worth mentioning for people that haven't played with the sequencer section in Thor, Tom has done all the work for you in setting you up, and you can actually get into, if I could just explain it kind of briefly here. If you look down at the last row in Thor there, you've got all those red buttons that are basically like steps in a step sequencer, and then you've got the knobs above them, or as Adam might call them, encoders. And
I'll stick with knobs.
But those represent the pitch of the note. And so if you wanted to kind of get into the idea of creating sequences using Thor and runtime sequences like that, you could take everything that's set up there and just adjust the pitches and find your own series of notes that maybe you like within that patch and kind of run with that.
Absolutely. And even just by changing the run type, so if I did change this to random and I pressed a note, now it's going to just start playing random notes from the sequence, and we end up with something with a completely different character. Which is really, really neat. And you could even just change the play type to reverse or pendulum or anything like that, and you would just end up with a completely different feel. So that's a really good way of getting tracks started, is just by kind of dipping into, I think there's a bunch of sequences in there. Just grab a sequence and play around with that and see what pops out. Maybe adjust some of the dials on the front. You don't have to get crazy with the programming to get some ideas going. You can just mess around with a couple of parameters and see what pops out. And that's fun.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I feel like that's kind of an important part of music making for me is if I'm enjoying the process and just seeing where it leads me, it's I love it. So not only I had that kind of as a starting point, but you may have noticed I've kind of dipped into the realm of blocks here. So pretty much the entirety of this track revolves around 3 individual blocks, and that's basically how I started that particular track and several other tracks I've done on stream. Is I'll spend a while creating a block that I'm happy with the sound of, then bring that into a second block, or in this instance a third block. So I'm just going to play the blocks individually so you can kind of hear how the tune sounded before I essentially started arranging it. So that was block 1. I think I spent about 40 minutes putting that together and just it's basically lots of elements that I could play with. I knew I wasn't going to bring everything in at once at the start of the track or anything. So it's kind of this, you end up in this interesting place where you already have a destination in mind for when you start the track. You know you're going to build up to this particular section. You just kind of work backwards from there. I find the concept of non-linear songwriting really fascinating and arranging. And someone mentioned to me recently that there's a musician called Luke Vibert who's a sort of incredibly prolific, excellent electronic musician.
Yeah.
And he apparently his method of working is he'll create sort of these 8 to 16 bar chunks of songs and put them in a track called put them in a folder rather called Threads or something, I think. And basically what he'll do is when he wants to actually write a complete track is he'll dip into that folder and then kind of unravel them and kind of let them expand. And he said he really, really enjoys that process of just kind of unraveling these tunes that he has already. And I just find that it's such a wonderful way of putting it, kind of just letting them sort of unravel naturally. So that's kind of what I'm doing here is I sort of have this block and I just kind of unravel it to create the start of the track. So I also created a second block, which is essentially the same as the first block, but with some slightly different chords. So I'm just going to play that. So it's pretty much just that repeated twice. So
okay.
Essentially what that meant was I had a destination in mind for kind of where the track was going to build to. And then when I got to that point, I realized that if I wanted to change things up a bit, then the option was already there. I could just switch it up to block 2 without having to mess too much with the arrangement. And then I introduced block 3, which is essentially just the same thing, but with just a static chord. So I could just kind of use that when I wanted things to kind of settle down a bit. And just by using those 3 blocks, I was able to very quickly piece together this entire track. So the actual arrangement process was quite quick. A lot of it was just kind of automating filters and controlling the density of drums and all that kind of stuff, just kind of controlling the flow of the track.
What I love about that, Adam, is that you've decoupled the sort of initial creative process from the arrangement and the heavy lifting of editing out parts from the production. And those are 2 very different mindsets when you're in those creative mindsets. So to be able to sort of decouple them and just think, first you're just going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at an 8-bar idea, and then once you have that, or once you have 2 of them or 3 of them, then you're going to go ahead and figure out, okay, I don't need this part yet, I can bring this part in later, and you can sort of develop the song. But it's like, I'm trying to think of an architectural metaphor that I can sort of picture it, but there's something to be said for, like, when we work in a traditional sequencer mindset where you're just going to work linearly, it's kind of like you're building the frame for the house and you're already thinking about how you're going to stage the interior decorating, and
Yeah.
it doesn't, you don't need to do it that way. You can look at it from a first I'm going to build my blocks. Talk about an architectural metaphor right there. First I'm going to build my blocks, and then I'm going to figure out the actual aesthetic of its development. You're doing that in a great way. I think that's something people
that's actually a really interesting way of putting it. And like, just to say, like, I do this all the time during my streams when I'm actually putting them together. But even when I'm sort of working on solo stuff or production tunes, this is basically how I always find the part of a track I'll get to where I'll really, really stumble and struggle to finish is at the point where I'm arranging the track. So once you have a rough arrangement done, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or if you're writing something with a more sort of traditional song structure, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end kind of thing, then, once you've got that structure down and you've got some music to actually accompany it, you're a long way to finishing the track already. Everything else is just kind of making tweaks and making sure that it flows correctly and that kind of thing. Once you have that basic arrangement down, that's essentially a demo, and you can kind of work from that. And that's kind of how I work with a lot of sort of the work I do now, is get the arrangement down first, and then really then I can kind of drill down on the more intricate details and that kind of thing. So it's a nice way of separating the processes and not getting too obsessed over details, which ultimately they might not necessarily matter until you've got the arrangement done. And so a good example of this is I've started using, for a lot of ideas I've been writing, I've started using sampled guitars, because I'd spend a lot of time recording a guitar part and getting it sounding exactly how I wanted it to sound. And then once I spent a little bit of time doing this, because I'm not a particularly great guitarist, I'd listen back to it and then realize, oh, this idea wasn't very good to begin with, and I've just wasted a whole load of time. Whereas if I'm using a sampled guitar to begin with, I can get a rough idea of what I'm going for, and then if it works, then I can record a guitar. So it's just kind of another way of sort of separating the process for the benefit of the actual track itself. I think this
is how Satisfaction gets the fuzz guitar. It's that same idea of just, I'm going to throw down, that's the 66 version of the same idea. I'm going to throw something down just to kind of mark the territory, and I'll come back to it. And then a lot of times that stuff is what works,
That is a wonderful callback to an earlier thing you said as well.
That's why they pay me the big bucks, Adam.
I love it. It just it just kind of gives this whole thing the feel of foreshadowing. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now there is something I wanted to sort of throw back. There was a comment that was made. I marked it way back when, but it is, I think, after having now looked through your song a little bit here, I think it's very an apt comment. Colin Quigley said, "It's funny how with." Wait, I just pulled it. Okay. It's funny how with the same stuff, we all tend to sound like what we sound like. It's an interesting celebration of music making. And I think, like, Colin, that is so true. Like, I love that. That's sort of how I started this, where I said, like, this is a very Fieldian track. But I guarantee you, if you cleared out your sequencer and just gave me this, in fact, maybe that's almost an interesting idea to do, to take someone's song and just delete the content from the sequencer, and you have to use their tracks, their bass sound, their drum sounds, their pads, and what song would you make? Because I guarantee you that the song I make would be very different than what you've made, and I would be using literally the same exact sounds set up with the same CB routings and all the effects, all that stuff the same. It would be very different, and I think that is a celebration of it's a celebration of a couple things: our individuality as music makers, the breadth of Reason's stock device sounds, and the type of music you can make with the same sounds. So yeah, Colin, you are correct.
I really like that observation. That is super interesting, and that actually reminds me of something I've spoken about before, which is someone's asked me, aren't you afraid that if you show off kind of how you're putting everything together, that someone else is just going to nick all your ideas and kind of just basically become Fielding 2.0? And it's no, I'm not even remotely worried about that, because I feel like
I've been trying to be Fielding 2.0 for 9 years. I can't do it. I've given up.
I've been trying to be Fielding 1.0 for a while, but it's
right.
I find that kind of notion quite amusing, because it's like, if I can show you how I put a track together, and then you can go off and create the exact same thing, exact same feel, exact same kind of emotional sort of feel to it, basically, then I'm doing something very wrong. Like, I'm not expressing myself in any way at all.
Yeah.
If you can literally just go off and do the exact same thing. So no, I'm not particularly worried about that, and that's why I've really just enjoy showing off various techniques and stuff like that, because it's just something I really enjoy doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've hit that point in the stream where I become hyper aware of occupying the rest of your day just selfishly learning from you, but it's probably the humane thing to do, to let you and let viewers get on with their days, make their own music, all that sort of stuff. So I'm gonna wrap us up here, but I wanted to ask Adam, standard thing here. I think you did this excellently last time, that this track might provide our outro music.
Oh, yes. Okay, I've got to man the master fader and
yeah, you know what to do here. But listen, before we do throw to that, I do want to thank you so much for being on. I think you do such a good job of explaining what is very technical things, but you make it accessible.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, listen, if it were up to me, maybe I'd have you every week on. I just enjoy learning from you. But I appreciate you coming on again and showing people this. The patches, a lot of the patches we talked about are going to be available. Stefan has posted a link to them, the Tom Pritchard patches, and we mentioned you can get them on Tom's Twitter as well, which is Patching Tom. That's his handle. I did say as well that Stefan posted the link, which saves you a trip to Twitter. But you know what? If you download these, it would be worth a tweet to Tom to thank him for this stuff, because I think it's so awesome that he has shared this with everybody, and this is years worth of his amazing expertise. So definitely send some love to Tom if you do, and share the music you make with him and us and everybody. All right, yeah, Adam.
I agree.
You want to say anything you need to plug or send people to?
I was going to mention, I don't want to plug too much, but if you want to check out the project file for this, I do have the project file for both this track and every other track I've done during my live streams available via a handy Dropbox link, which I could send to you, Ryan, afterwards, and you can do with what you like, I guess.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll get it over to Stefan, and he'll get it out to people. Cool. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you like that, I guess check out my stream, because I do this a lot.
There you go. I was not going to let you be so modest as to not plug your stream. Your stream is on Twitch, is that correct?
That's correct. It's generally every Thursday at 7 p.m. British summer time. So 7 p.m. UK time, essentially. So yeah, I tend to be there every Thursday. I just can't stop myself now.
That's excellent. Okay, well, everybody should go and watch those. They're incredibly fun. And if you enjoy Adam on this stream, you'll enjoy him even more when I'm not interrupting him. So, Adam, you want to give us
lots of awkward silences.
Do you want to give us a play on there, and I will lead everyone out here on this wonderful Tuesday live stream.
Okie dokie. Well, thanks again for having me, and everyone have an awesome week.
Alrighty. Cool. Well, that's the show. I think we've done it. I'm going to just do it. Hang on. Adam, actually, you know what? Can you, on your end, can you cut me, about minus 12 or something? Perfect. All right, guys, that is it for our stream this week. I hesitate to call it a show because that feels a little too television-y, and it's not. It's a stream. We're just hanging out. But that's it for our stream this week. I hope you got some ideas. I hope you grab Tom's patches. I hope you tune in to Adam's live streams, because there's so much you can learn from him and just get inspired by. And I certainly do. And that's what I'm going to do some of this stuff during this week. That thing we did with hooking up Pulsar to modify a synth drum pitch just ever so slightly. I'm going to nick that. And I've been thinking about, ever since I said it, I've been thinking about this idea of stripping out the sequencer and seeing what music you would make with the same exact thing. I think we're going to do a stream with that coming up, whereby maybe I make some music with your files that are empty of sequencer data, or vice versa. I send you guys a song I make without the song in it. It's like a song without the song. We got to think up some name for it. But I think I'm going to do that. It's a cool idea, I think, that we can have some fun with, and we will. And with that, I think it's time to say we'll see you next week. And have a good week, guys. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to vote. Early voting, California. It's out, and I am going to vote. So have a good week. We'll see you next week. Enjoy. Keep making music. And I'll see you next time on the Reason live stream.